Hi, I'm Carmen Cracknell. Welcome back to Forbidden Talk, where this week we'll be tackling the issue of domestic violence, an issue affecting millions worldwide. Today, we'll try to find out if domestic violence is more common in Middle Eastern countries and communities than elsewhere, and if so, why, by looking at the psychological, cultural and religious aspects. Joining us on the panel today in the studio are Nezahat Cihan, Director of Operations at the Iranian and Kurdish Women's Rights Organisation, and Dr. Savin Bapir, counselling psychologist who also works with IKWRO. We'll also be joined by Ghazala Avan, Director of the Campaign to End Violence Against Women at the Scottish Muslim Women's Resource Centre. But first, let's take a look at this report.
About a third of women worldwide have been physically or sexually assaulted by a former or current partner, according to the World Health Organization. Domestic violence, which can involve physical, psychological or sexual abuse, is quite widespread throughout the Middle East, but it wasn't until recently that countries have actually begun addressing it in their legal framework. Last year, Saudi Arabia's cabinet passed a ban on domestic violence and other forms of abuse against women for the first time in the kingdom's history. A campaign calling for an end to violence against women was run for the first time earlier in the year, using an image of a woman wearing a hijab with her eyes visible through the slits of her veil. A landmark bill, the Protection of Women and Family Members from Domestic Violence, was passed by the Lebanese parliament on 1st April. Human Rights Watch and Lebanese NGO Kaffa, which means enough in Arabic, say the issue of domestic violence in Lebanon is widespread. Kaffa says analysis of media reports show that 25 women were killed by family members between 2010 and 2013. But the real figure, according to the organization's co-founder Ghada Jabbour, is likely to be much higher, as there are no national statistics on domestic violence, and often cases go unreported. But while these steps are a positive sign, it is yet to be seen whether or not they will actually bring a real change in the Middle East.
Nezahat, we'll start with you. Could you provide us with some definitions of what actually domestic violence is?
Okay. Domestic violence, as we define, is an incident or series of incidents, violence or abuse, between 16 years old and over, this is for the UK, 16 years old and over, in an intimate relationships. So when we say intimate relationships, this could be between husband and wife, between family members, this could be between boyfriends, girlfriends. So this is the definition of domestic violence. Domestic violence, as we saw in the film as well, can be physical. Usually this is the most common kind of form of domestic violence that is known to the public. So physical could be kicking, biting, pushing, pulling hair, quite common forms of violence, physical violence. It can also be psychological and emotional, so threatening to kill, isolating the victim from the rest of the community or family members, belittling the victim in front of children, in front of family, in front of friends, and swearing again. It can also take the form of sexual violence, violence using force to have sexual relationship, or using other objects in sexual intercourse.
So it is a very broad
It is
definition.
very broad.
And Savin, could you tell us a bit about the psychological effects and the reasons why domestic violence occurs?
To actually comment on the reasons, that there is a variety of things and we cannot comment on it one cause. However, on the psychological impacts that it does have on women are great. They start from having a lot of psychiatric diagnoses such as depression. They can develop post-traumatic stress disorder, other forms of anxieties as well. Most importantly, these women tend to develop a lot of negative beliefs about themselves and others and lose a lot of their confidence and their self-esteem. And it's important to also note that it has a great impact also on the children. The children may experience a lot of nightmares about the domestic violence. They might have develop behavioral issues as well and difficulty in themselves concentrating also.
Well, now joining us on the show is Ghazala Avan, Campaign Director at the Muslim Women's Resource Centre. Thank you very much for joining us, Ghazala.
Thank you.
And You work at a resource centre for Muslim women. What do you commonly encounter in cases of domestic violence there?
The kind of issues that we've come across have been, as some of the previous interviewees have described, physical abuse, emotional, psychological abuse, women being put down all the time, told that they're not good enough, what they're wearing is not appropriate. There's also financial abuse, so money's withheld from them. The control of money, for example, lies with a man, and they could be living in a very affluent area, but they just don't have money, for example. So these are some of the things that we've come across.
And I think we want to get to the bottom of whether this is a cultural, a social or a religious issue, or a combination of the three. Nezahat, how much of a role does religion play in justifying maybe some people's interpretation of how they can treat their partner or their children?
Yeah. First of all, domestic violence is a universal issue. Domestic violence doesn't only happen in some communities, it happens in many communities. If I want to give a statistics in the UK, for example, and this is for the whole of the UK, not only for ethnic minorities, 1 in 4 women in their life suffer from domestic violence in the UK, and about 2 women a week are killed either by their current or previous partners. So it's very, very common in other kind of the overall. In terms of the role of religion, and some communities, specifically communities that we come from, it is very, very high. The level of domestic violence and the severity of domestic violence is very, very high. For example, for women in the UK, again from UK context, white women suffer from domestic violence around 11 times before they ask for help, whereas ethnic minority women suffer around 17 times before they start asking for help. So there is difference between some communities. In terms of the role of religion, there are different arguments on that. As kind of you may know, there are different interpretations that we hear about religion, but religion is as kind of Islam or Christianity or Catholicism, Catholics, they are quite oppressive towards women. There are a lot of inequalities within religion towards women, and that actually makes the subject even worse. And there are kind of some relations or references in the religion where actually permission is given to male actually to do whatever he likes in a sense, or however he likes to women. But there are different interpretations, I'm sure our guests will talk about.
Yes, Savid, do you feel men, maybe Muslim men more than men from other communities, feel like they have a right to maybe perpetrate domestic violence more?
I think it is not just based on religion. We need to take into account the social norms as well, and what are the men's right within that culture, and what is the norm of the man. Perhaps this might be a contributors in how they will behave within the family.
And Ghazala, what do you think about the religion issue? I mean, there is a verse in the Quran which says, from those wives who you fear arrogance, advise them, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. Do you think some men interpret that as a rite of passage to beat their wives?
Well, I think if you listen to some of the scholars that have actually studied the subject really, really well, they would say that's absolute nonsense. Unfortunately, I know this particular ayat in the Quran does cause a lot of misconceptions. I think what men do, they do in any community, and sometimes it's almost like it's there, it's in the text, so people think that they can just use it. But essentially, those kind of things are right across all cultures and all communities, and unfortunately the power happens to lie with men, and the privilege happens to lie with men, and it's just about men abusing that. But if you look at some of the scholars, I mean, we've made a film recently called Imams for Change, which people can access on YouTube. And that film specifically talks about this idea that marriage is based on love and mercy, and without that, there is no marriage. So these are some of the things I think we really need to focus on, as opposed to maybe being critical of Islam as a religion or any religion.
So thank you, Ghazala, for joining us on Skype. We'll have to end it there. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Bye.
We took to the streets of London to ask people why they thought there were no laws on domestic violence throughout the Middle East. Let's take a look at what some people said.
I don't think there's a lot of sort of women aren't seen equals in the Middle East, which I think is a bit unfair.
It's a cultural thing, isn't it? Very much a male-dominated culture.
While they don't have any, I guess it may be rooted in religious beliefs, or it could just be a historical cultural system that just perpetuates itself. And so if you don't have any means of changing it, then it doesn't really change.
So we can see from the Vox Pop results that people do associate male dominance and control over women with the Middle East. Nezahat, I know this is an issue close to your heart due to your work at your organisation, which focuses on helping victims of abuse, much of which is domestic. What does it say about countries in the Middle East that there are no concrete laws that tackle domestic violence?
Well, the Middle Eastern countries are very male-dominant communities, the countries. Male dominancy can be seen anywhere and everywhere. And this violence against women in general, but specifically when it comes to honor-based violence, forced marriage, female genital mutilation, because we define that as general violence against women and girls, it is part of everyday's life. It's so part of the way that we are brought up. For example, we are brought up to respect men around us. We are brought up to be somebody's daughter, somebody's sister, and later on somebody's wife. So in terms of developing our individual identities, we are not given chances. So the male-dominant culture does affect us quite a lot in our bringing up. And some of us actually may not be aware that we are facing violence. We might just assume that this is how things are. And by the time they are aware of the violence, they have suffered so much that it's so difficult for women to get out. So this is the level that is happening in the Middle East. And when we look at the culture, because it's so much male-dominant, male privilege is such kind of enjoyed by male dominancy, it's very difficult for them to see the reality, or they don't want to see the reality. The rulers usually are male. When you look at the power and control relationships, the section that have power to change things are men themselves. And we were just talking about religion, for example. Religion is written by men, and so everything is around men, and they don't want to change this system because it suits their interests quite well. Because the violence against women and girls is coming from male dominancy, is a male violence predominantly against women and girls, and this culture suits them, and that's why it's so difficult for women's organizations to get something done in those countries.
Have you seen any cases of where men are actually abused by women?
Oh yes, that happens as well. In the UK, for example, 77% of violence is against women and girls, and around 23% is against male victims. The male victims are usually, the violence against male victims are usually happens between same-sex relationships, so gay relationships.
So again, it's men perpetrating the violence.
Violence again, but it does happen from women to men as well, although this is a very, very tiny minority that happens, so predominantly it's around against women and girls.
And Savin, you've been involved in several case studies. Is there a common pattern in those people from the Middle East who suffer domestic abuse? Is there anything specific to people from that part of the world as opposed to others?
Well, as Nezahat was just talking about male dominance, that is a big factor, because the women, in order to protect themselves from further physical and verbal abuse, they would tend to submit to that control and that power. And women will find it difficult to reach out for help because if the man has the control and the power, sometimes they're not aware of their rights. And often the main focus for the woman becomes the submission and how to try to avoid being physically attacked again.
And what about the kind of culture of women feeling like they are they're not the victim, they're actually to blame. Is that quite common as well?
That is very common. Most often when I have worked with women, it takes a very long time for them to realize that they have actually been a victim. Most often they will see themselves to be blamed. They will think that it's because perhaps that they were not a good wife. Or women who have experienced FGM, which is well documented, that this woman will find it difficult to gain any sexual arousal or engage in any sexual activities. And these women will often think that perhaps because they were not able to give pleasure to the men, so it was their fault that they were physically violent towards them. Almost often when there are cases where these women are getting raped, and they think that perhaps it was them that led them on.
Nezahat, could you talk a bit about marital rape as an issue within domestic violence?
Yeah. Well, marital rape, even in this country, wasn't recognized as rape until about 1991. So it was only in 1991 the law changed and recognized the rape within the marriage. In terms of Middle Eastern countries, it's extremely difficult to get governments to accept that the rape happens. As actually, just want to give an example, just recently in Lebanon, a judge in the Sunni religion court spoke to CNN, and this is what he actually says to CNN. Marital rape could lead to the imprisonment of the man, whereas in reality he is exercising the least of his marital rights. So this is kind of a person in the power describing marital rape as a man's right to passage within the marriage. So the rape, if we want to give a definition, usually there is this misconception that rape only happens from a stranger, whereas actually the study shows within Rape Crisis Center in the UK there was a study, and it shows that about 85% of the rape is actually done by men, or the men that women actually know. So the rapists are known to the women. So the marital rape is the rape that happens between the marriage, when actually women don't want to have sexual relationships, but actually they're forced to have sexual relationships, or they're raped. So no consent is involved. The woman does not consent to the sex, but the man rapes the woman within the marriage. And usually this is not seen as a rape, but from kind of our communities, because usually they say, oh, but they are married. You know, he's got right to have sexual relationship because he's married to her. And she has to provide him with kind of whatever he wishes to. So because of that, and because of kind of cultural norms that we are under, the effect of religion, the effect of culture, actually justifies the marital rape. And in Iraq, again, another case is there to legalize marital rape. And again, it's a known fact that they're trying to reduce the age marriage to 9.
Why do you think that Saudi Arabia and Lebanon, especially given that Saudi's human rights record is not so clean, that they're the only two countries that have decided to make domestic violence illegal? Yeah,
well, they are. I mean, there could be pressure from kind of whoever, I can say. It's not, I don't think it's their free choice. There been pressures to do that. But what kind of I want to say is changing the law around domestic violence or making domestic violence a criminal act is not going to change a lot in those countries, because what happens on the paper is very, very different than what happens in the reality. In most of these countries, for example, violence, some sort of violence is kind of forbidden, or it's against the law. But if we want to give the question of Turkey, for example, domestic violence is a crime. So, but we know that domestic violence rates have gone up about 1,400% in the last 10 years. Wow. So every day a few women are killed by their partners or ex-partners. Although they seek help, and this happens in other countries as well, not only in Turkey's situation. They seek help from the government, from the police, but the police themselves actually sends them back to the perpetrators, their partners. Or there is no social welfare system as such that can protect these women, because asking help is putting kind of these women in more risk. So there should be a support mechanism around them actually to make sure that they are safe once they're looking for. But that's not happening. It doesn't matter whether it's part of law or not. Is that just with Middle Eastern
communities, or in general, do you think, where it's more pronounced?
In general, it happens as well. I'm not saying things are perfect in this country, for example. There are a lot of women's organizations fighting to bring more actually services, specifically following the financial crisis. Actually, a lot of women's organizations, and specifically BME, Black Ethnic Minority Organizations, have closed down. So the support for women and girls in the UK is shrinking as well because of kind of given reasons. So it does happen here as well, but at least in this country there is a support mechanism if a woman is trying to escape from violence. Not that, I mean, in some countries there are women's aid, for example, refugees, but those refugees are known by the perpetrators, so the addresses are known. So if woman flees to that refuge, the perpetrator goes, or the husbands goes, and they bring them back home. And once they are back home, they're usually killed. This is a very, very common scenario in countries like us, because there is not specialist service provided by women to protect women who are looking for help.
Savin, do you think Middle Eastern women are less aware of their rights than others from other groups?
I think for sure. And it's not just women who live in the Middle East, but women also in the UK, because when they arrive here, they often are very isolated by their husbands. So they are not often aware of their rights or the help that they can get. For instance, many of the clients I have worked with, they have not asked for help themselves. They often, a neighbour heard noises and called the police, so often social services get involved. So I believe that there is a lot more to be done to raise this women's awareness, but it's difficult to get at them because often they are, as I said earlier, very isolated. So they're very controlled, they're financially dependent on their husbands. They often cannot even go to the doctors by themselves. They are accompanied by their husbands, or even when the children go to school, often the husband takes them. So it is very difficult for them to be aware what is the help and their rights in the UK. And we can imagine how much more difficult it must be women in the Middle East, because most often, also as Naza had mentioned, there is not a general support network there. And most often the women fear that they might not have any more contact with their children once they flee, and also the taboo and how they will be perceived by the rest of the community and the family. So
these are the reasons they don't come forward?
These are a few of the reasons, yes. Of course, each case can be perceived can be viewed as individual cases, but this is the more general general obstacles that the women face. But the major one is the perception and how they will be judged and criticized by the rest of the community, which then we're going into honor-based violence.
When they do come and seek help, do they come alone or do they come with a family member?
I often see women who have already separated or are divorced. I have not worked with a woman who is already in their relationship. And often when these women do come, they do not recognize that they have been a victim. They continue to blame themselves, because we have to remember that the psychological impact that they have is very long term, especially on women who have experienced FGM and women who have experienced marital rape. There has been many studies who have reported that women who have experienced, for instance, marital rape, their psychological impact can be much more longer than women who have only experienced domestic abuse, or women who have experienced rape by a stranger or someone else other than their partner. And
why do they blame themselves? Is that a cultural thing, or is that a general thing?
I think this is more developed through time. Well, when the man has the control and is dominant, and he often in the relationship there are abuse that happens where the woman feels humiliated as well. Then often the woman will be they will try to make sense for themselves as to what is going on for them. Often they will be in denial. They will think, oh, it didn't happen. Other time they will try to rationalize, and the way they rationalize it, it will be, oh, it won't happen again, or perhaps it was my fault because I was not a good wife, or because he asked me to do this and I didn't do it properly. So then that results in a pattern. So they continuously start blaming themselves, develop a lot of negative beliefs and negative feelings about themselves, about other people, the world around them. And because they're unable to protect and help themselves inside, they then feel that this is the same what happens outside, that they cannot be helped.
But why? Why do they feel as though they're responsible? What are the specific reasons why?
Often this results as part of the
what do they
verbal
feel
abuse.
that are their wrongdoings?
This often results from a lot of verbal abuse. I had many women who said to me, I think that him broken my arm, it was okay because he got healed. He broke my leg, he got healed. But when he called me this and he called me that, this stayed with me. And this is playing in their mind over and over again. And most often the men will use words or things that are culturally very demeaning and shameful.
But what have the women actually done wrong in their own minds? What do they think that they've done wrong?
They feel that they have not lived up to the expectation of the husband. This is what they feel. But in fact, when you sit down and to challenge that, what is it that they feel they've done wrong, when you challenge that with them, they are able to then see that actually
so
it was
it's their
not
own psychological blockages that are making them feel in this way.
And it's a way for them to kind of make sense, because humans need a reason to understand, why did this happen to me? And we often do not go to look at things objectively. We choose things to match our own beliefs. And this is what happens. Because these women are not able to speak to somebody else. They're not able to talk about what they're going through. For somebody else to say, it's okay, it's not your fault. They don't have that. They're very isolated.
And Nezahat, what do you think the role of religious figures in the community plays, and imams?
Yeah, before we go to that, actually, just to add what Savin said in terms of why women blame themselves mainly, because this is how we are brought up. We are brought up to be good daughters, good wives when we marry, and sometimes the families actually say themselves that when you marry, you leave this house in your white wedding dress. You can only come back to this house in your kafan, in your shroud. So no matter what happens in between, you have to suffer. It's your husband. He will love you, he will beat you.
So this is really about appearing well in the community and not bringing any shame upon the family by admitting this publicly.
Exactly, because if she does something and then she will bring shame in quotations, and that's when honor-based violence starts happening. Because if the family's honor is perceived to be damaged, then the family needs to do something about it to, in inserted comma, to clean their honor. And women know that very well. Women know that they are actually used as the tools to actually represent the honor of the family. And this is very, very difficult for women from our culture to change. And this is one of the reasons probably they blame themselves if something goes wrong. But if we come back to the role of the religious leaders...
I just want to ask, Savin, how do you deal with a woman who is very afraid of shame? How do you psychologically manage with a person like that?
Well, there is different ways and techniques, but most importantly, you need to understand what is the shame for that individual, for that person. And as Naza had quite rightly pointed out, is most often the shame of how they will be perceived by the family. How their children, when they grow up, how would they appear to the rest of the community and the family. So it is very important to first work with that woman and to normalize, to help understand where that shame is coming from. Because most often the shame, there is also the guilt as well, and is quite irrational and quite excessive, the amount that they experience it. And it is not just a shame that we will often experience just once, in small incidents during our life. This woman, the shame and the guilt affects them so much that it affects their day-to-day basis. So, for example, they might avoid certain places, they might avoid people, and what I would do with them is help them, first of all, to work with some of their behaviors, to look at things that they will avoid. How can we encourage and how can we encourage that woman to then engage with those behaviors and attend certain social situations that she would normally avoid, and to make sense what that shame means for that woman, and help her challenge some of the perhaps negative or irrational beliefs that she might have around the shame that she's experiencing.
Okay, so to go back to the religious community involvement.
Yes, the role of religious leaders, unfortunately, the role that they play usually, they do a lot of mediation in domestic violence cases. And why they do that? Because they think family is more important than actually women and children in terms of what they suffer. So they try to protect the whole family institution rather than trying to help the victim, who is suffering quite badly in some cases. And in some cases, when the women are sent back to their own violent situations, they get killed. It's quite common. So they have to stop that, first of all, because they have to put women on the spot, they have to put women in a protective measure, first of all. No mediation. We don't do any mediation at all. We actually make sure that women are safe and given enough resources to continue to be sure. And there are religious leaders that have actually a lot of effect on communities. The communities, some parts of communities do listen to them. And if kind of, it says that there are different interpretations of religion, there are different interpretations by different people. So if the religion, as they say, doesn't allow this to happen, then these religious leaders have to do something about it, because it is happening. It is happening in all our countries under the under the eyes of the religious leaders, and they actually contribute to that. They actually
like I mentioned in the Quranic verse earlier, isn't not obviously domestic violence, but a little bit of physical punishment actually permitted in Islam.
Yes, it says
from a husband to a wife.
It does say in different parts of the Quran. It does give permission to the husband actually, and in one verse, I don't remember exactly what it says, but it says the women's body is your field. So plow as you wish, whatever way and however way you wish. So it actually gives men the right to actually the passage to do whatever he likes to the women. So if the religious leader says that this is not Islam, so they have to do something about it, because this is what it says, and this is actually how it is practiced in many countries, and by religious leaders as well as by other members of the communities.
So, Savin, besides religion, how do maybe conditions, psychological conditions like OCPD and others, play into men's behaviour towards women?
There's actually not enough research done to comment on the only thing that research has pointed out is that a lot of these men often experience excessive amount of jealousy, and they often want to have a lot of control and power in the relationship, and the woman is not perceived as another human being, that perceive them as an object or the property, so it's their property and they can do what they like with it. So that kind of belief often they feel that because of that they can do whatever they like, everything is permitted.
So it's not necessarily down to any kind of condition that doesn't ever come into it at all?
It is very difficult to comment and say that this is the cause. Perhaps there are other risk factors which may contribute to somebody to be more likely to behave in this way. One person can say alcohol can also be a contributor, drugs can be a contributor. However, it is important to note that one thing that is lacking in this relationship is clear boundaries and an understanding what a healthy relationship is for both the woman, for the man, and also for the children, because let's not forget the children are affected greatly by what's going on between those two adults. An example, earlier we talked about marital rape, but it's also important to note that marital rape has also a great impact on children. For example, Campbell and Alford found in their study that 5% of the women reported that their children were also forced to participate in the sexual assaults. Another 18% of the women reported that their children had witnessed at least on one occasion the rape. So this then the woman feels perhaps unable then to protect herself, but also to protect her children.
And Nezahat, what is actually being done within Middle Eastern communities and by NGOs to tackle the issue of domestic violence?
There are very good and very strong women's movement within Middle East in general, and in some countries more than others. But it is, again, it's extremely difficult to run a campaign or to carry out any women's work in countries like ours. Because as soon as you want to do something, you are confronted with resistance, and sometimes deadly resistance as well. We've lost so many women to women's movement, to women's freedom movement. So women's organization situation is really, really hard. There's not enough funding. Well, there's hardly funding actually in some of the countries. There is a lot of resistance from the government as well as the members of the community, and there's a lot of resistance from the religious leaders, the religious institution itself. So they actually face a lot of resistance, and it's extremely hard, but they still carry out a lot of kind of good work and putting pressure on government to change.
Obviously,
the
because
laws.
the governments are led by men and they are highly patriarchal, there's less work.
That's one of the main difficulties, actually, that alongside cultural, traditional, religious reasons that we are talking about, when you look at the power and control, men have the power, actually. So women, as you saw in the Arab Spring, women were on the streets, they were fighting, they were kind of joining their male components to actually carry out the fight. But when it came to the parliament, elections, women backed down. So men actually were elected to the highest levels. And this happens overall, actually, in many Middle Eastern countries, that women don't have enough power in their hands to change things for good. And again, just to add, actually, probably the issue of domestic violence in our countries is very much related to honor-based violence. Sometimes actually any slight movement from the women, either she wants to leave the house or she wants to seek divorce, is immediately seen as an honor issue. And when it's seen as an honor issue, not only the family, the whole community, the whole religious establishment gets involved in this to punish the woman.
Besides the religious and the community help, what do you think organisations like the UN do? Do you think they're doing a lot to tackle this issue?
Well, organizations like UN, I don't think they're doing enough to tackle the issues. There is always focus on other countries rather than Middle Eastern, and that actually the issue of Islamophobia, the issue of offending kind of the religion of Islam or those who represent Islam, the Islamophobia is so high, and they actually get probably so worried about offending kind of those governments. They do some work, but the work they do is very, very mild. Actually, it's not touching the essential bits of the work, and it's not touching the things that they need to change. So they fund women's organizations, for example, to carry out some awareness issues.
Even though it's an issue that's mentioned in the Human Rights Convention, which is part of what the UN tackles, do you, and also other countries, do you think the Islamophobia issue is a big one, that they're worried to maybe impinge on a culture that they don't want to get involved in?
Yes. I mean, we have the same issue here as well. When kind of we work with women from Middle Eastern backgrounds, actually, we work with social services, we work with the police, we work with other agencies, and they have this. Most of them, not all of them, most of them have the same mentality. When actually it's a woman from Islamic background, they actually think that it's their culture, it's their tradition, this is how they are, they don't want to touch. Because if they open the box, it's like Pandora's box. If they open the box, they don't know what they're going to be faced with. And some of them know what they're going to be faced with, but they don't want to do that.
What about other communities in the Middle East, such as Christians, though, and besides Muslims? Do they have any involvement in those communities? The UN and NGOs, are they more active in non-Muslim communities?
Yeah. I don't have much kind of information on that, about kind of how much they are involved in Christian communities within that. But we know the women from Christian backgrounds suffer similar violence, same as kind of women from Islamic backgrounds. So in those countries, in that sense, they are affected as much as kind of other. But in terms of how much UN is doing with Christian communities, I don't have much information.
So it is more of a social and cultural issue rather than religious?
The domestic violence, you mean? Well, it is combination of all that. So it's not only one issue. It is a combination of culture. It is a combination of tradition, religion. Power and control by men, men's privilege over women and girls, and the fact that they want to protect that privilege and they don't want to let go of that privilege over women and girls. The main kind of reason is male dominancy, and male are dominant both in culture, both in tradition and religion, as well as parliaments and in the government. So because they are in control and this is their privilege to keep, they don't want to let go of that.
And Savin, how many cases have you actually seen, and what is being done within the psychological aspect to combat this issue?
I have worked with quite a lot of cases since I have been working for ICRO. What has been done in terms, I believe that there is a lot that needs to be done, because a lot of the clients that I see are often Kurdish speaking and do not speak any English, and women who have previously been to seek other psychological therapies, perhaps on the NHS. However, they found it very difficult to work on the issue, because the work was done through an interpreter. And this is a big issue, because when we are talking about the fear of being criticized by the community, they don't feel that they can trust. So they often minimize their symptoms. They don't work through directly their issues. I believe that a lot of research needs to be done, perhaps to adapt certain therapeutic models to work better, where they take into account a lot more the cultural and the norms and their societal beliefs as well, where it can be challenged more appropriately. So other therapists who perhaps are not from Kurdistan will also be able to help Kurdish victims. But it's not, I am talking about Kurdish because I speak Kurdish and I'm able to speak with them directly, but there is also other women who do not speak English, but it can be somebody from Iran or somebody from Iraq speaking Arabic. So there is a lot more that needs to be done.
Well, we'll have to wrap up the discussion there. Thank you to all my guests in the studio, Savin Nezahat, and on Skype, Agizala. And be sure to join us next time for more discussions. Bye for now.